Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution by Lindsay M. Chervinsky, narrated by Janet Metzger. Introduction. At 11:30 in the morning on August 22, 1789, a large cream-colored coach pulled up to the front door of Federal Hall at 26 Wall Street in New York City. 6 matching, perfectly groomed horses pulled the elegant carriage with sparkling gold trim. The coachman, outfitted in crisp white and red-trimmed livery, jumped down from the back of the carriage and opened the door. An elegantly dressed man with powdered hair stepped down with a portfolio of papers under his arm. He towered over his companion, Henry Knox, the acting Secretary of War, and his slaves tending to his horses. His ornate coach and his imposing presence drew curious stares from strangers passing by on the street. He walked up to the front door of Federal Hall and was immediately announced to the Senate. George Washington, the first President of the United States, had arrived for his first visit to the United States Senate. This was no ordinary meeting. 2 years earlier, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia had agreed that the Senate would advise and consent on treaties and other questions of foreign policy. But in practice, how the President and the Senate would interact remained for the first office holders to work out. Washington's relationship with the Senate was just one of countless governing details that he had to establish as the first president. Establishing precedent for every presidential action consumed his thoughts in the first few years of his administration. Not only would the American public and an international audience judge his every action, but his successors would be guided by his choices. The stakes could not have been higher. The future of the Republic rested on Washington making the right decisions. He approached every new situation with caution and took action only after consulting with his advisers. His first visit to the Senate was no different. The tense relationship between Native American nations and the United States posed an immediate challenge after Washington's inauguration on April 30, 1789. Most Native American nations had sided with the British during the Revolutionary War, recognizing the threat that American settlers posed to native land. On September 15, 1789, representatives from the national government, North and South Carolina, the Creeks, and the Cherokees planned to meet to discuss the controversial treaties signed between 1783 and 1789 and to negotiate a new treaty. Washington had to select the representatives to send on behalf of the federal government, another important first for the new president. At his August 22 meeting with the Senate, Washington planned to seek advice about what instructions he should give to the commissioners. Because he considered Native American relations to fall under the heading of foreign policy, he followed the constitutional guidelines calling for him to meet with the Senate. On May 25, 1789, less than 1 month after his inauguration, Washington sent to the Senate all of the United States' previous treaties with Indian nations, along with a number of supporting documents. After a brief discussion, the Senate postponed its consideration of these papers. At the beginning of August, the Senate created a committee to meet with Washington. The committee planned the minute details of the upcoming meeting, down to where Washington would sit and how he would enter the chamber. On August 20th and 21st, Washington nominated commissioners to negotiate with the Southern Indians. On August 21st, he sent an official note to the Senate announcing his visit the next day to discuss the terms of the proposed treaty. When Washington and Knox arrived at Federal Hall at 11:30 a.m., the doorkeeper announced their arrival. Washington sat at the front of the chamber, and Knox took the chair to his right. Washington handed his remarks to Knox, who in turn handed them to Vice President John Adams. Adams read the statement, but as Senator William Maclay from Pennsylvania recalled, the senators could not master one sentence of it. Adams wasn't known for his public speaking skills, but the senators' struggles weren't entirely his fault. The Senate gathered for their work in the large chamber that occupied the first floor of Federal Hall. Because of the August heat in New York City, the doorkeeper had opened the windows in search of a cooling breeze. But along with fresh air, noise from Wall Street's pedestrians, carriages, peddlers, and horses flowed into the Senate chamber. The clamor overpowered Adams's voice, so few senators could make out the words that Washington had carefully crafted. After a few complaints, Adams repeated the speech from the beginning. Washington's remarks offered a brief synopsis of the current diplomatic state between the United States and the Southern Indians, and posed 7 questions for the Senate to answer with an aye or a no. Adams finished his recitation and sat. The seconds ticked by as the senators remained in awkward silence. A few shuffled papers or cleared their throats. Maclay speculated in his diary that his colleagues were so intimidated by Washington's presence in the Senate chamber that they cowered in shameful silence. Eager to show that they could be active participants in the creation of foreign policy, Maclay stood up and suggested referring Washington's 7 questions to committee for discussion in detail. Washington lost his temper, stood up, and shouted, "This defeats every purpose of my coming here." The senators fell into a stunned hush before Washington acquiesced to Maclay's suggestion and offered to return to the Senate a few days later. Although he did return the following Monday, his first visit to the Senate was an inauspicious start to the executive-legislative relationship. As he returned to his carriage, Washington muttered under his breath that he would never return for advice. He kept his word. August 22, 1789, was the first and last time he visited the Senate to request guidance on foreign affairs. Unfortunately, the diplomatic challenges facing the United States during the Washington presidency were just beginning. More than 2 years later, on November 26, 1791, Washington invited the department secretaries and the Attorney General to the first cabinet meeting. Secretary of War Henry Knox, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph convened in Washington's private study on the second floor of the President's house in Philadelphia. The cabinet met a handful of times in 1791 and 1792 before the threat of international war with France and Great Britain forced the cabinet to meet 51 times in 1793. By mid-1793, the cabinet served as a visible, central part of the executive branch. Despite the important role that the cabinet would come to play, the United States Constitution actually does not mention a cabinet at all. Article 2 permits the President to request advice from the department secretaries, but specifies that the secretaries must provide their opinions in writing. Nor did Congress pass any legislation to authorize the cabinet or regulate its meetings. On the contrary, in 1787, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention rejected several proposals for an executive council, including a proposal by Charles Cotesworth Pinckney that would have established a cabinet almost identical to the one that Washington eventually created. So where did the cabinet come from? Washington designed the cabinet to
Sample complete. Ready to continue?